Good afternoon. Welcome to Penn Engineering's 19th Heilmeier lecture, a lecture that was originally scheduled for March 26th, 2020. I'm Vijay Kumar, Dean of the School of Engineering and Applied Science. The George H. Heilmeier Faculty Award for Excellence in Research was established in 2001 and for the purpose of recognizing excellence in scholarly activities of our faculty. And this is the George Heilmeier Lecture. It's named in honor of our alumnus, George Heilmeier, class of 1958, an electrical engineer trained at Penn. He was the winner of the 1991 National Medal of Science, the 1997 IEEE Medal of Honor, and numerous other awards. He received international recognition for the discovery of several new electro-optic effects in liquid crystals. And it's because of him we had the first development of the liquid crystal display, the LCD, for watches, calculators, and instrumentation. The award in his name not only recognizes innovation, but his extraordinary support for Penn Engineering and his leadership and public service to our nation. Much of this, of course, is history, but I can tell you that even today, his impact is felt every day at DARPA, an organization that he directed from 1975 to 77. The so-called Heilmeier questions that still guides the strategic thinking of the director and all the program managers at DARPA as they develop their research agenda. Here are the key questions. George Heilmeier would ask, what are you trying to do? Articulate your objectives using absolutely no jargon. How is it done today, and what are the limits of current practice? What is new in your approach, and why do you think it'll be successful? My favorite is who cares? If you are successful, what difference will it make? What are the risks? And here's something that all faculty will relate to. What are the midterm exams and the final exams to check for success? For the past 19 years, the school has awarded Heilmeier Awards to an impressive list of faculty, which truly reads like a who's who in engineering. And I just want to read out some of these names: Ray Gordy, Dennis Disher, Dan Hammer, Michael Kearns, Dawn Bunnell, Pedro Ponte Castaneda, Nader Engeta, Scott Diamond, Rajiv Alor, Karen Winey, John Vose, George Pappas, Shu Yang, Daniel Kodachek, Jason Burdick, and Vivek Shenoy. It's now my great pleasure to invite Zach Ives, the Chair of Computer Information Science, to introduce the winner of the 2020 Heilmeier Award, the Eduardo D. Glandt President's Distinguished Professor in the Department of Computer Information Science, Dr. Dan Roth.
Thank you, Vijay. It's a privilege to be able to introduce Dan Roth as the recipient of the Heilmeier Award this year. Those of us who know Dan know him as a true Renaissance man in the artificial intelligence area, as well as its many applications to society, technology, and medicine. Among the most important of the applications he looks at include understanding medical records and addressing the problems of fake news. For his groundbreaking research contributions, Dan has earned many recognitions. Among these, he's a fellow of the AAAS, the ACM, the AAAI, and the ACL for his contributions to machine learning and natural language processing. Dan describes his research interests as being in the foundations of intelligent behavior, developing techniques that span natural language understanding, machine learning, and reasoning. And indeed, his talk will draw connections among all of these topics. Dan, a warm congratulations on your award, and we're excited to hear you talk about the challenges of reasoning.
Thank you very much. Let me start by sharing my screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, so let me start by thanking the Heilmeier family for this award. As someone who is involved a lot with DARPA, both with grants and as a member of ISAT, I mean, the questions that Vijay alluded to are really important and guide us. They guide us a lot. And I'm going to try in my talk to address at least the first few questions. And let's see if I manage to do this. And before I go on, I of course want to thanks Vijay and Zach for their kind remarks and introduction. I want to thank my family. They really have made everything I do possible and worthwhile. And I want to thank my students, past and present, and colleagues that have taught me so much and really enabled my research program over the years. So with that, let me actually move to what my students and I do, which really is everything that we think is important in order to advance natural language understanding. And that means dealing with a lot of sub areas, from events, dealing with time, quantities, spatial, to semantic typing, to textual entailment and question answering, summarization, multilingual NLP, with important application areas like navigating information pollution and natural language processing in the medical domain. All these depends on dealing with some fundamental questions in learning, reasoning, and representation, and a few other important issues. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to try to address some fundamental issues, mostly in reasoning and learning, and I'm going to exhibit this through the applications or the questions in natural language understanding that deal with events and mostly with time. So just let me start by reminding you all that AI and NLP in particular is in the news. It's really riding a wave. It's not the first time we are riding a wave, but this one seems to be bigger than before because machine learning and especially deep learning has brought a lot of excitement to this area. Now, there's been a lot of achievements over the years, most of them even pre-deep learning or its impact, like IBM Watson, our ability in translation, Siri, and colleagues that many of us are using, speech recognition, and so on. But the excitement over the last few years exceeds that by a lot. And we can see titles in the media, how to solve 90% of NLP, AI outperforms human in question answering. Really not the case. And of course, we also see some more sane articles that place this in a better context. And really, the truth is, if you want, that there is a lot between where we are today in natural language understanding, even though there's a lot of things that we can already do and are trying to do. And if you don't believe me, here is Google as of last night. Some queries that I posed to Google. When did Canada become part of the United States? You can see the answer. This is something that is close to us here at Penn. Which president discovered electricity? Or what year did Tom Hanks land on the moon? So now that you've been entertained, the question is, so what should we do? And I want to start by going back 50 years ago, where Terry Winograd wrote a thesis at MIT called Shrewdlu, really a computer program that was able to converse with users via natural language about the block world, a virtual world. And what you can see here is a typical example of the type of things this program was able to do. Very, very narrow domain, very brittle. Of course, in '68, this was considered a major success, but Terry Winograd knew that we are far from being there, because in order to understand language, execute instructions, and interact, we really need real language understanding and reasoning abilities. Fast forward 50 years, this is our project that is called Communication with Computers, a DARPA project. And what you see here is that we are playing with Minecraft. And we have an architect that provides instructions and a builder that tries to understand the instruction and follow them. And here is an example of a chat between a human architect and a human builder with Minecraft as the application. And think about trying to mimic that or reproduce something like this or learn from this a program that will replace either the architect or the builder. Not so easy. So what has happened between Terry Winograd's and our target configuration, a giraffe here that we want to build? Well, let's take a very simple example, a very much simpler scenario where we have a board and we have a lot of blocks on this board. In this case, the blocks are named because we want to avoid the reference problem. So we just give them names like McDonald's and Toyota and Adidas. And an instruction in this case could be move UPS from the left side of the board to just below Starbucks, leaving a small gap. Can we develop programs that understand this and execute something like this? Well, not so easy, because one of the examples in this data set reads like that. Imagine that this is a chessboard. Place UPS in H2 and McDonald in G6. Well, hopefully you find this interesting. Can you follow this? I'm sure you can. But what is needed for us to be able to write programs or induce programs that can do this? And of course, today's technology allows us to train huge models on specifically this type of examples. And after a few thousands of chess understanding examples, we'll be able to do this. But then we'll introduce something that is somewhat different, and everything is going to break down. So of course, there are many NLP tasks that we are much better at today, mostly, but not only at the sentence level, and mostly extraction tasks. So today, I'm going to try to provide some optimistic thoughts and challenges from the perspective of learning to reason about these kind of situations and others in the context of mostly reasoning about time. How can we think about learning in the context of doing reasoning? And no better way to start with this, which provides a way for me to think about what is really language understanding. So I'm sure you can all read this. And if you want to unmute yourself and say what you read here, that would be nice. Some of you have seen it, many of you haven't. So anyone wants to guess?
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Very nice, and you know, always surprising to see how quickly people can get this. But if you think about it, this is a good abstraction for natural language understanding. You have to identify units. You have to consider multiple representation and interpretation, pictures, text, layout, phonetics. You have to put it all together and determine the best global interpretation that satisfies your expectation. You know that I put all of it on one slide. I ask you a puzzle. There must be an answer here. So this is, in many respects, the challenge that we have, or at least part of the challenge that we have in natural language understanding. And you can already see one aspect of the computational problems. We have to identify and assign multiple values to multiple variables while we account for interdependencies among them. So as I said, this is one key aspect of natural language understanding. Natural language understanding decisions are global decisions that require that we can make a lot of local prediction, driven by different models, trained in different ways at different times. It requires the ability to put these predictions together in a coherent way, and it requires knowledge that guides these decisions so that they can satisfy our expectations. Of course, our programs need to do a lot more than that in order to understand language and communicate in natural language, but it already exemplifies some important aspects, that the discrete reasoning aspect, and the fact that understanding sometimes can be viewed as the best interpretation of something. Let's move on and think about dinner. So imagine that this A here is one of your favorite assistants. Could be Alexa, could be Siri, could be your Google Assistant. Where do you want to go? I really enjoy Mexican food, but not when it's spicy. The assistant would ask perhaps, how about Mexican restaurant with plenty of non-spicy options? Is there one in Philadelphia? Here are a couple of good options. So how do we model something like this? And how do we abstract it? So one way to think about it is the one that I show here on the top right. So we are looking for a restaurant. The cuisine has to be Mexican. It has to be in Philadelphia. And we have some additional constraints. So we want that the restaurant will have a menu. We want the menu to contain dishes. And we want at least one dish that is non-spicy. So while today we always think about how to model things with machine learning and deep networks, and this is fine because even in this context, we'll have to use neural embeddings for the predicates and the functions. Nevertheless, this shows that our reasoning here has to incorporate declarative constraints. It doesn't matter how you implement this, but at an abstract level, that's the kind of thing we're doing. So today, a lot of people think that symbols, a lot of students of AI, if you want, think that symbols are an evil invention of all the AI people. It's not. Whenever you think about text, you see that language is really a symbolic system. You can read a recap of a football game from Saturday or some political news event, and you can see that it talks about touchdowns, it talks about the Packers, it talks about Rem Emanuel, and it talks about $10 million. Language is really a symbolic system. And even though we communicate via speech, gestures, writing, which are continuous, the symbols are really the invariance of this communication. So the desk that I'm sitting on right now is really a symbol that represents a collection of things in the world. And these are the things we reason about. And of course, many thinkers have said this in the past. So if you go to Yuval Harari, Sapiens, he talks about language as the ability to assign symbols to things and reason about them, and thinks that this is the key to human cognitive revolution. Sol Kripke, that I don't pretend to understand most of what he says, but one of the things he did say is the importance of naming things as a key to communication and cognition. And if you think about developmental reasoning, which is discussed in the Enigma of Reason, you will also see the same kind of evidence. So if we do think about symbols, we can think about this guy that hopefully many of you can recognize. If you don't, this is Aristotle. And this is perhaps the most important logician who laid the ground for syllogism, a method by which non-information can be used to prove a point. And people that have taken AI classes years ago also will know this famous example due to Aristotle. So now that we think about Aristotle, did he have a laptop? Hopefully many of you are smiling now because this is a trivial question. All of us immediately get the answer. By the way, Google would think that it does have a laptop because there is a book called Aristotle's Laptop. This example, by the way, is due to Les Valiant that presented it in a talk that he gave here at Penn a couple of years ago. Since then, we've written a paper about this that is about to come out. But this really illustrates a really important point. The fact that even though in NLP today, we can address quite well-defined tasks for which we have a lot of data, but we don't know how to address who asks the questions. And in this specific case, all of us would converge to about the same decomposition of this question. We want to know about when Aristotle died, we want to know about when the laptop was invented, and we want to know which event happened first. So the question there, if we want to understand language and interact in language, the question isn't whether we need reasoning, but rather how to do it. So how to determine these strategies on the fly. So this question was probably new to all of you. Nevertheless, you can determine this strategy on the fly and instantaneously. And how to train for it. So how can we supervise to support these sparse events? The Aristotle example or the chess example that I've given before. I typically have a whole talk on supervision, or what I call incidental supervision, which I'm not going to do today, but I will address a little bit the issue of supervision, and especially should we learn everything together, or should we try to decouple problems or decompose tasks? Of course, this is not a new set of questions. My thesis 20 some years ago was titled Learning to Reason, and we showed at that time in a formal way the advantages of joint learning and reasoning, what is called today end-to-end, if you want. But since then, we've also realized that it's important to ask the question of when do we need to decouple learning from reasoning, how to decompose, and how to compose in order to be able to solve or address utterances that you've never seen before. So there is a lot of evidence today that our AI systems are not doing reasoning. Some evidence that was developed in my group and some by many other groups. And moreover, we fail miserably when facing new situations. So what I'd like to do in the rest of this talk is basically argue that it's time to reason. Time to think more seriously about how to address these sparse challenges. And I'm going to try to do it via examples mostly, because there is no time for that, but I'm going to try to address 3 types of examples. The first one has to do with assigning values to multiple interrelated variables. And you can think about the nice to meet you example, if you want, as an archetypical example of that. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about decisions over a dynamic set of interrelated variables. You can think about the Aristotle example as an archetypical example. I'm going to focus here mostly on temporal common sense. And finally, I'm going to talk about reasoning as the process of computing functions over multiple interrelated inferred variables. And we can think about examples such that understanding a recap of a football game, who scored the last field goal for the Eagles, or understanding electronic health records. This is an example from Brian Litt's lab on a report on epilepsy, where we try to identify what is the frequency of the seizures here. So let me start with the first type of example, and I'm going to talk about events. So really, natural language is here in order to allow us to describe and communicate about events. You can think about political events, you can think about, natural disasters events, and we want to be able to understand events independently, extract them from text, and identify their arguments, and we want to be able to understand relations between events. Really, this represents an important move in natural language understanding from what used to be mostly a sentence level study to understanding language at a situation level. Now, if we want to think about relations between events, one of the important things to do is to understand time, the relation of time. And when you think about reasoning about time, you can see that it's very important to distinguish between, when you consider these 2 events, people who are angry and police use tear gas, between placing them this way on the timeline. It represents that people were angry at something which ended in violent conflicts, and then the police used tear gas. Or if we consider it this way, where police use tear gas and as a function of that, people were angry at the police. So understanding time is really important, but in natural language, we rarely see explicit timestamps because authors typically assume that we as human readers understand time and we can figure out things from cues in the text and from our common sense. You will never see something like this. Police used tear gas at 7 p.m. and stopped at 7:30 and so on. Really, vagueness with respect to time is inherent, and we should be able to understand language well enough and acquire enough common sense knowledge so that we can understand it. So one of the key tasks that we have to start with is understanding temporal order of events. So if you see a snippet of text that describes this natural disaster here, you want to be able to extract the event, put them in a graph, and identify the edges of this graph. What happens before, what happens after, what overlaps, and so on. And this is a very difficult problem, partly because it's very hard even for humans. I mean, so if you have n events, you have order n square of edges, and even humans typically are not capable of annotating all of it. So you will see a partially annotated graph if you give this to humans. However, we still understand things because we have very strong expectations from this text. One of them is transitivity. We know that if A happens before B and B happens before C, then A happens before C. Or in this case, if cascaded happened before ordered, and reaping is a sub-event of cascaded, we know that reaping also happened before ordered. But we also have other more statistical expectations. For example, if I show you this piece of text at the bottom right, more than 10 people have, police said, a car on Friday in a group of men, and I ask you what happened first, event 1 or event 2, you have no clue until I show you the lexical items, and now you know everything because you have an understanding of these lexical items. So the question is how to exploit these declarative and statistical expectations that we have, and how and why does this impact our ability to generalize and supervise, or generalize from a little supervision in this case. So I'm not going to give a lot of details, but I will just tell you that over the last few years, there's been a real revolution in temporal reasoning. Due to many steps, due to many reasons. A lot of it is the thesis work of my student Xiang Ning. But really, a lot of it can be attributed to the ability to reason with external knowledge, declarative knowledge like transitivity, and statistical knowledge like common sense knowledge, and putting it into models that allow us to learn, and on top of learning, do some level of reasoning. When we talk about statistical knowledge, we can think about understanding distributions of events. I'm sure many of you will find this more appealing, where we look at Glandt, we typically know what could have happened before Glandt. We seek, we request, we write, and what might happen after Glandt. We use, we pay, we speak, we work. So acquiring these kind of distributions has an important role in trying to help us understand the order of events given in text. And of course, this can again be implemented within the same computational framework or its neural counterpart. Now, this goes beyond just temporal relations between events. We can think about sub-event relations. We can think about event coreferences. And in all cases, we want to be able to implement this today via neural architectures, but importantly, we want to be able to enforce some logical constraints that we can do, for example, by converting these declarative constraints into differentiable learning objective and support these kind of inferences. Now, I want to deviate a little bit from this algorithmic perspective and say something about why is this important? Why is it important to have structures, and where does it help us? So really, you can think about structure as a type of indirect supervision signal. It saves a lot of annotation, saves a lot of supervision. And you can think about it from multiple perspectives. One way to think about it, about the reason structure actually helps us, is to think about it from an information theoretic perspective. So this will allow us, or allows us, to support quantifying the benefits of giving additional labels. And what you can see is that the tighter the structure is, the more expectation you have from the output, the more information you have, external information about the task, the tighter, the less structure, the less supervision you need, because the benefits of additional labels diminishes. So as an extreme case, if you look at the graph here on the left, if I know somehow that the labels on all the edges is the same, it's sufficient for me to look at one label, and I know how to label all the edges. If, on the other hand, I know that these labels are independent completely, then I need to identify all of them, and I will need more supervision for this. So the truth is often somewhere in the middle, and we can quantify it, and in fact, even show for a range of natural language processing problems that as the structure or the level of constraints we have tightens, we actually need to use less examples. You can look at the same kind of phenomenon also from a learning theory perspective, where you want to ask the question with respect to partial supervision, as I discussed before, with respect to constraints, with respect to many other forms of indirect feedback that we can get from the environment. You can ask the question, under what conditions on the indirect supervision can we guarantee learnability of the original classification problem? And it turns out that we can actually develop such conditions that are often realistic and show that indeed we can replace quite often direct supervision, a lot of annotation, with indirect, weaker supervision signals. And that's really important if we want to be able to move forward in this reasoning space. So let me move on to my second example that has to do with decisions over a dynamic set of interrelated variables. And again, we can think about the Aristotle example, where we have to develop a strategy, a reasoning strategy, and this reasoning strategy has to start by deciding what are the variables, right? Do I have to know when he lived, when he died? Do I have to know when laptops were invented? And what functions do I have to compute over it? I'm going to address a prerequisite for this, and I'm going to deal mostly with temporal common sense. So all of us do this every day, all the time. When we look at events like Dr. Porter on the left is taking a vacation versus Dr. Porter on the right is taking a walk. And we want to know whether we'll be able to see them soon. We know that a vacation is going to typically take days or more. A walk will take minutes or something like that. And therefore, the one on the left is will not, and the one on the right is will. So this is a task that is very, very easy for all of us. We do it instantaneously without thinking about it at all. What we are not aware of typically, unless we worked in this domain, is that every piece of text that you read really includes a lot of implicit events and implicit assumption, many of them temporal, that you take for granted. You never think about it. So if you just look at the text snippet on the left, it really hides a lot of temporal information. For example, we know that this guy, Bill, went to college for about 4 years, probably started around when he was 18. He spent in North Carolina about 4 years, while Duke has always been in North Carolina, not only 4 years. He joined Google probably after he graduated from college, and so on and so forth. A lot of implicit temporal information that you and I read whenever we read this piece of text, even though there's no number there and very little explicit temporal information. So one important effort that we've done over the last few years, mostly work of my student, led by my student Ben Zhao, is to look at multiple aspects of temporal common sense, from the one that I mentioned before on relations between events, to understanding the distribution over typical time of events, duration of events, frequency of events. So this involved basically learning what is called today a language model for a temporal common sense. And this will allow us to understand a temporal distribution that will represent as a distribution over time units, seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks, and so on, and allow us to predict a distribution or induce a distribution over taking a walk and taking a long vacation. And this is a real output from our system that show that we can actually know a lot about these events. Now, without getting into the details of modeling, I want to highlight that there are two key issues that we have to attend to here. One of them has to do with context. How long does move take? Moving a chair doesn't take as long as moving a piano, which doesn't take as long as moving to a different city. So we want to be able to develop contextual distribution over these time units. And the second issue is joint modeling, because a lot of information in text is quite implicit. So people will typically not write explicitly in text, how long does it take to brush one's teeth? But they will say, I brush my teeth in the morning, I brushed it in the shower. And by looking at relations between events jointly, you should be able to infer distribution over these implicit events too. And at the same time, you also want to be able to be aware of some natural declarative constraints, like duration is 1 over frequency. And this will allow us to model things jointly, but at the same time, develop distribution, both for duration and frequency, for example. So without getting into technical details, I want to say that, temporal common sense is a real prerequisite for our ability to reason about a lot of things. And there's been a lot of progress in this, as you can see in the picture on the top right and the other distribution that I've shown before. We kind of know how long it takes to open a window, even though no one says explicitly how long it takes to open a window. And we've made some progress, at least we know how to ask the questions on things like what things change with time and what do not change with time. Someone's height typically doesn't change after a certain age, but someone's location does change with time, and the Empire State Building location doesn't change with time, I hope. So there's a lot of questions that we are able to ask today, and some of them we can even answer. However, we can still not answer the Aristotle question. And we don't even know, will we make it to dinner before the movie? So if you think about specifically this question, what does it take to answer a question like this? Well, you have to know when is the movie. That's easy. You have to know what's the time now, also easy. And perhaps you can use Google Maps to tell us how long it takes to drive from where you are to the movie. Notice that this is a pre-COVID question. Now we are doing things differently. Hopefully we'll be able to ask these questions again pretty soon. But you see, there's a lot of other implicit events that you have to account for when you try to address this question. Depending on the type of dinner, what is the typical duration of dinner? If you want to drive there, what kind of a detour is that going to impose on you? Maybe there's a parking problem next to dinner or next to the movie. And after inducing all these variables, you have to put it together and reason about your plan for starting from now all the way until you reach the movie. So thinking about functions over these variables, thinking about developing a strategy is the next thing I want to address, how to compute functions over multiple interrelated inferred variables. And again, you can think about the recap example here on the side, or the seizure frequency estimation as typical example of what we want to do here. So whenever we think about text, there are multiple challenges challenges that we have to address? Well, we have to understand the text. Each one of the stories that you see here on the right, from completely different domains, from football to politics to medicine, requires that we identify a lot of events. There's touchdowns, there's seizures, requires that we identify a lot of people. There's Emmanuel Ram, there's Desmond Clark, requires that we identify temporal arguments 2-3 times a month, or other quantities like 9 million cases, or the length of a touchdown, or $10 million, requires that we identify relations between these entities. For example, what team does Desmond Clark play for? If you read this piece of text, you'll see that it doesn't say explicitly. But all of us will be able to infer what team he plays for. So this is the first step that we have to do when we try to understand text. Of course, we should be able to understand questions about the text, question that you ask yourself, or question that someone poses to you. How much did his challengers raise in the case of Rem Emanuel, or who scored the longest touchdown pass of the game? And you should be able to understand the question and really decompose it to multiple components, because the answering the question at the top requires that you identify touchdowns, you identify the length of the touchdowns, you identify who scored the touchdown, and then you are able to compute maximum over this. So you should also be able to reason about these variables that you identified. So while I will not be able to talk about everything we are doing in this domain, a lot of it is work by my student Nitish Gupta, I want to attend to one issue that is necessary for us to be able to reason, and that's the issue of supervision. How can we supervise so that we can support this level of reasoning? And really, there are two extreme cases here. So there are way too many latent decisions, many of them ill-defined, that we have to be able to perform in order to understand this test. There's no way that we can supervise at this level. The only reasonable and realistic supervision approach is n-task supervision, where you are posing a question, for example, and given the answer, you try to propagate it back to understand what the text says. This is an effort that we started about 10 years ago, but even that is way too loose, because there's so many latent decisions, and one signal, the answer, doesn't give us enough information about all the latent decisions. What should we do here? So one way to think about it, or at least one way that addresses some aspects of this supervision, is acquiring indirect signals. So if you think about trying to answer a question like this, who scored the longest touchdown pass of the game, the first step to do is to parse the question. I need to be able I need to know that I have to find a touchdown, I have to find the length of the touchdown, I have to find the max, and I have to find who scored it. And I have to execute all these components, right, on the text. Now, if I'm able to do this for the same price of dreaming up this question, I can dream up many other questions that are related to it. For example, who scored the shortest touchdown, or how many touchdowns were scored, or how long was the longest touchdown. And the interesting thing about dreaming up these other questions is that I can dream it up in such a way that they share a lot of latent decisions. And if I'm trying to make this formal here, so if Y is the prediction that I'm going to make, it's a function of multiple latent variables, the G and the H here, but I can imagine many other questions that share the G and the H here. And if I can do this, then eventually I'm going to be able to force these latent variables to be similar, or to have similar distributions. Seeing this pictorially, we can look at this question here and the parse tree that we have to develop for it or induce for it. And once we have that, we can dream up some other questions that have similar components, like finding a touchdown or finding a field goal. And we can enforce consistency between the outputs of these shared substructures. And this is one solid way to perform supervision without actually costly supervision, and therefore support reasoning about this. And one can show that this can provide better compositional generalization. So let me finish my presentation with another challenge. Cliff Notes. Many of you know and love Cliff Notes. And if you think about it, really we're talking about understanding natural language, understanding perhaps multiple documents in natural language. And specifically, I want to attend to the challenge of understanding a book. So if we think about this book, Charles Dickens' David Copperfield, this book is about David, his life from infancy to adulthood, his experiences through this time, the people he fell in love and out of love with, and all the events that happened to him. And when you read this, you know this is fiction. At the same time, this book happens in London and England in the 19th century, with background of the socioeconomic state of England in the 19th century, child exploitation, state of schools, prisons, the immigration to Australia. These are true historical facts. And as human readers, we don't have any problem distinguishing between this and in fact learning from the true historical facts. How do we do it? How can we develop assistance that will help us, human readers, to read these books? Or if you want, after a break of 3 weeks in reading the book, help you come back to it. What are the computational tasks that we should think about? And how should we develop these reasoning capabilities? Still a challenge. And with this, I'm going to summarize. So I was trying to give you a small sample from a research program that attempts to address some of the key scientific and engineering challenges between us and understanding natural language. I focused on reasoning about events and time, thinking about common sense, and thinking about supervision that facilitates this type of reasoning. And I'd like to thank you for your attention and happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much, Dan, for that wonderful and inspiring talk. We have the Q&A box available for any questions that folks may have. So please feel free to chime in with your questions. While we're waiting, maybe I'll ask a question about especially the temporal common sense part of things. One thing that as humans we seem to do pretty well is understand when the description is sort of incomplete. So when somebody asks us a question where we don't really know how to answer it, we can identify that. It seems like Siri and a lot of these other tools are pretty terrible at that kind of thing. Do those kind of problems come up often in practice? And are there ways that you can deal with that, sort of, knowing when you don't know, et cetera?
Oh, excellent question, and very timely, because we actually have a paper in submission on I don't know questions. I think this is essential. It's essential in multiple contexts, but definitely when you ask questions, you want to be able to know when you don't have an answer to these questions. We are very bad at it. We are very bad at it even in rather limited situations where all you need to do is to extract answer from the text. You don't need to invent anything. And it's very important in many applications, because if you want to understand events, one way to understand events is to ask questions about the event. I want to know, when did things happen? Where did things happen? Who did what to whom? And so on. And in many cases, we have to understand that not all the information is available to us in the text, and we have to distinguish between when it is available, when it's not. Yeah, so it's really a very, very important topic that we are not doing so well on. But there's a lot of work nowadays, a beginning of work at least, on these topics.
Thank you. It looks like there are now a couple of questions in the Q&A box, so I'll read it out, but please feel free to read the text as well. Laura asks, some of the implicit knowledge you discussed is subjective or variable. How do you think a system should accommodate a range of common sense reasoning, or when our common sense is broken for a particular situation?
Yeah, this is completely true. In fact, a lot of the things that you infer from text are variable and subject to interpretation and have multiple perspectives. And one of the challenges of dealing with reasoning is understanding the text to the extent that you can understand that there are multiple perspectives. This is really important nowadays when we read news. And some people try to deceive us, but it's always important. You know, if you ask a question like, you know, should we wear masks given the COVID situation? So even these kind of questions, the answers to have changed over time because the understanding has developed, depending on the audience or who needs to wear mask and who should not wear mask. For example, young kids should not. So there are multiple perspectives to all answers, and one of the challenges in reasoning is to be able to figure out these things. And again, I'm happy to put a plug into a line of work that we have been developing on perspectives. You can find it on our webpage where we develop approaches to given documents, try to identify what are the different perspectives that they express and what is the evidence that we can find for each perspective identified.
Thank you. There are actually a number of questions now, both across the Q&A and chat boxes. Perhaps a good one to start with would be a question from Yosef, who asks, how do you see inference in this area connect with causal inference and representation by Pearl and others?
Yeah, it's another great question. So, you know, you can see, first of all, I think causality is really important. But we have to distinguish between causality as expressed in text, when someone tells you that this causes that, or you see that something follows that, and the real causality in terms sort of the Euler-Pearl's type causality. I think though that there's a lot of relations, and in many cases we should be able to understand text well enough so that we can infer causality, and hopefully some of the tools that we are developing in text understanding will also allow us to understand causality. It's quite possible that just text isn't sufficient to understand causality, and we'll have to move to multimodal reasoning in order to support these kind of things in a broader way.
Thanks. For those who have additional questions, please feel free to send Dan an email after. I'd like to now hand the mic over to Dean Kumar for some closing remarks, and thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. That was an amazing lecture, very thought-provoking. I wondered if your NLP system would remark about the obvious awarding of the 2020 Heilmeier Award in 2021, if I mentioned pandemic somewhere in the sentence. And you know, I'm sad that we're nearly 10 months late with this recognition, one of the many impacts of COVID-19. Also, if this were a regular Heilmeier lecture, I would be presenting you with a beautiful plaque that symbolizes the Heilmeier Award, and we would all be gathering for reception in Levin lobby. And all the questions that are flooding chat would have been asked of you live. But we have to take a rain check on everything, including the reception. But we will be mailing you the plaque. And to all of you who attended or watched this talk, thank you all for joining. This talk is being recorded. So those of you your friends who could not join it, please tell them that the talk will be online. But before you leave, please join me in congratulating Dan. And I don't know how to give you a virtual standing ovation, Dan, but I just want you to picture this. Thank you for this amazing lecture.
Oh, thank you all. And I'm very happy to get questions, comments, suggestions by email later.
Bye, everyone. Stay safe and
Bye.
take care. Bye.